Hi everyone, I'm Heather Stewart. I'm the economics editor of The Observer and the chair of this event. Welcome to the... Oh, nope. That's better, isn't it? That's a lot better. Thank you. Welcome to the Bristol Festival of the Future City, which is part of Bristol Festival of Ideas. We'd like to thank especially Arts Council England, Innovate UK, Bristol City Council and the University of the West of England for supporting the Festival of the Future City. And I hope you've been enjoying it. I certainly went along to a couple of things this morning which were absolutely great. So we're here today to talk about city devolution and what someone at the Treasury the other day talking to me called the devolution revolution, which I imagine is a phrase we'd probably like to hear George Osborne using a bit. As you've no doubt seen, there have been a whole series recently of new deals done with cities, with city regions, devolving spending powers and in some cases tax raising powers down to the local level. We've got a brilliant panel here today to talk about what exactly that means, what problems it's likely to solve, what problems it's likely to create, and what impact it's likely to have on the sort of deep-seated regional inequalities that the British economy has had for a long, long time. Oh, and I should say that if you want to tweet, the hashtag, which you may already have noticed, is Future City 15. Should you wish to tweet, which we encourage you to do if you're a Twitter type person. So as I say, we've got a brilliant panel who I'll introduce from my left. Alexandra Jones is the director of the Centre for Cities, which is a think tank which specialises in exactly this, how to promote regeneration in cities, what powers cities should have, and so on. Mike Emmerich. He and I worked together in different lives about 15 years ago, we were just saying, but in his current life, he is at a consultancy called Metrodynamics. He was very involved in the Northern Powerhouse deal and has also been advising Birmingham, I'm told, on the, what do we call it, the Midlands engine, isn't it, I think? Capital M, capital E, I think the press release said. Right. Next is Mark Tewdwr-Jones, who is the Professor of Town Planning at Newcastle University, and more importantly for our purposes today, the Director of Newcastle City Futures. And to my immediate left, almost needs no introduction around here, I would have thought, is George Ferguson, the Mayor of Bristol. So, Alexandra, I'm going to ask you to speak first, if you like, and we're going to have sort of 5 to 7 minutes from everyone, and then we're going to strike up a bit of a conversation among ourselves, and then I'm very keen to get as much kind of participation going from the audience as I can. So we will then turn ourselves to questions and comments from you. But Alexandra, if you'd like to start, that would be great.
Great. Thanks, Heather. And it's great to be here. As you said, the Centre for Cities is all about this agenda. And we've been arguing for more devolution to cities and city regions because it will strengthen their economies for many years. So it's been great to see the progress made. I've been asked to give an overview of where we are. I could speak about all of this at some length, so I'm going to stick to the overview of where we are. I want to speak very briefly about 4 things. First of all, why has this happened? I think if you don't understand that, you don't know how you can keep it going. Second, what's being devolved, how much it varies. Third, what's not being devolved. And finally, very briefly, what it might add up to, because I think the others are going to be speaking a lot more about that. First, why has it happened? As I say, if you don't know why it's happened and why devolution went from meaning Scotland and Wales only and from being quite a niche topic to being something that everybody is talking about, I think it's quite hard to keep the momentum going. I think what we've had is a really interesting combination of the Scottish referendum, increasing public interest in these issues, the politics making sense, the Conservatives and especially the Chancellor wanting to demonstrate their one nation credentials, talk much more about the North, the Northern Powerhouse, and you've had the Lib Dems' interest in this agenda when they were in coalition. You've had people, the Chancellor, Greg Clark, Nick Clegg when he was Deputy Prime Minister. You've had austerity, making this the only way really to manage cuts on the scale that's being contemplated is to put things at the local level and get local decisions about how do you make some of these decisions about what's most important for the local area. And it makes economic sense. It's made economic sense for years, frankly, that actually cities are driving growth. They should make far more of their own decisions about transport, about housing, about planning. That's the best way to make sure that they thrive and therefore the UK economy thrives. But that economic point has always been true. Actually, it's been true for decades. So ever since the knowledge economy and knowledge has mattered more. So I think if this debate's going to continue, and if we're going to understand how some of these deals that we've seen now have happened, we have to keep thinking about the public debate and how that's shifted and how it needs to keep shifting, the politics, the personalities, the money, and the economics. And I think it's only if you think about all those things that you can really understand what's happened, what is happening, and what might happen in the future. So that's why I think this has all happened. Second, I've been asked to talk about what's being devolved. You've had a lot of deals announced recently. So you've had city deals and growth deals over the last 5 years, but most recently, the biggest shift, I think, has been with devolution deals. They've been announced with Greater Manchester, then Sheffield, then the North East, Merseyside, and the West Midlands most recently. What you've seen is some individual differences, but actually some very similar broad themes. So all of them have signed up to Metro Mayors over an agreed geography because the Chancellor said no Metro Mayor, no deal. And you can see that some of the areas which you might have expected to get a large-scale deal either haven't been able to agree the geography or haven't been able to sign up to a Metro Mayor immediately, and therefore they just haven't got these deals. So in the past, places like Bristol, West Yorkshire have got deals, certainly have got powers, making real progress, and I'm sure George is going to talk about this, but the more recent spate of deals, they haven't been part of this tranche. So what have they got? They've all got powers over transport. So responsibility for a devolved, consolidated transport budget, multi-year settlement, franchise bus services. Really what it means is they've got responsibility for the transport budget over many years so they can make the decisions and ideally get integrated ticketing so you don't have to get multiple tickets to get around an area. They've got powers over strategic planning. Some of the detail looks a bit different, but basically they can take decisions about planning across a wider area, across that city region, metro mayor area. They've got power over skills. Most places, less detail in Greater Manchester at the moment, I'm sure that will change, have agreed some kind of review about post-16 skills. They've agreed they'll co-design employment support. They've got packages in place for the hardest to help. So all of them doing stuff around skills and employment. All of them doing stuff around business support, actually supporting businesses. It makes no sense to do this from Whitehall. They've got more responsibility over business support, integrated work on investment and trade. And all of them have got a slight variation on 30 million a year for 30 years, which was first agreed with Manchester. They're not all the same. So each deal's got individual quirks. In Sheffield, there's commitment to government support for a science and innovation audit because they've got the advanced manufacturing park. In the North East, you've got an investment fund. And so they're using that 30 million a year for a big investment fund. Greater Manchester's got 6 billion of health and social care to deal with and to manage. And they've got the Fire and Rescue Authority and lots of individual details. Some places have land commissions, some have got more extensive reviews of skills, some have got power over the roads. But the broad themes of skills, infrastructure, money, planning, they're all broadly the same, and so they should be, because actually that's what makes a difference to local economies. And I'm sure what you'll see is these powers may look the same, but they'll be implemented differently in different places. And everywhere is going to get power over the power to retain 100% of growth and business rates from 2020. So that's kind of some of the fiscal powers that were mentioned. Everywhere with mayors will have the chance to increase the business rates if the businesses agree on the local area. So you've got some broad themes that are same in the deals. You've got some difference, and you've got evolution. So the Manchester deal, for example, has evolved over the last few months. You're bound to see that happen. And in fact, that's what we should see happen. We should see places continuing to come back and agree with central government where they get more powers, and in the meantime get on with things and keep pushing and doing their own thing and doing it in their own way. And you see that in places, whether they've got a devolution deal or not, increasingly places just driving their own agenda. Very briefly, because I want to come to an end, I think it's important to note this represents significant progress, but we're not in a position where cities have the same power as their international national counterparts. So fiscal devolution, it's inched its way onto the agenda, but you don't get greater variation of council tax, you don't get to set tourist taxes, you don't get to retain stamp duty. None of that's on the agenda at the moment. And I think unless you get more of that on the agenda, it's going to be hard for cities to really own their own future in the way they should. And a lot's going to be shaped by next week's spending review. So until we know the scale of the cuts, until we know what actually is being devolved in terms of money, until we know how many pots are together, it's difficult to know exactly how good these deals are and how everywhere will be affected, whether you have a deal or not. And there's still issues about control over money. So we don't have fiscal devolution, we don't know about the scale of the cuts, and we don't know how much control over the different pots they will really have. So, I think the final point from me, huge progress has been made. If you'd said 5 years ago, you'd have these kind of different deals with major places around the country, from the kind of city deals you had 5 years ago through to the big-scale devolution deals today, no one would have believed you. Big progress. I think the big questions are what will be announced next week, how much Whitehall genuinely lets go, and how much cities, whether they have a devolution deal or not, have the ambition to keep pushing, keep changing things, and keep making a difference to their economies.
Mike, Emmerich of Metrodynamics, you've been quite intimately involved in the Manchester deal, I know, and that's seen as one of the I suppose, city region most likely to make a success of it. Is that fair? How's that worked, and what does it tell us about the other deals and how?
So yeah, I was involved. I was one of the co-authors, I suppose, of the Manchester deal. In my last job, I've just finished 9 years of working in Manchester before setting up this the company that I'm now running with a couple of colleagues. And I think the Manchester deal is a great success because Manchester had 30 years of working together and has led the way because of the 30 years of working together that the Greater Manchester authorities have had through the Association of Greater Manchester Authorities, working together on regeneration, on the airport, on all sorts of things in the city region. But I think there's some really important things we've got to learn from the Manchester example. And I can see playing out because we advise the West Midlands on their deal and the North East as well, actually. And I think I can see some big stuff coming out. And I want to take up where Alex left off, really, because one of the critiques of this whole thing is that we're going to destroy the National Health Service. We're ripping apart great national institutions. The reality we face in our country is that social mobility has stagnated. The returns from health have fallen, and that a lot of the big challenges we are facing, which are chronic health problems and intractable problems of welfare, are not, on the evidence we have, being sorted by national solutions. And that's what Manchester was working away at for a generation or more, leading up to this deal. So, yeah, we need to see more deals, but I'd say above all, we need to grip these issues, and we need some experimentation, because, of course, our National Health Service was created by William Beveridge, looking at the cottage hospitals and the other things in the interwar period of what they had done and turning them into national policy. Well, the problem is, when everything's top down, you don't get as much innovation. So this is about rebalancing the system to put a bit of innovation in the areas which just happen to have the worst problems and the biggest opportunities, which are called cities. So I think that's the first big lesson to learn. But I think I've got 3 challenges, and I set these out in an article in The Guardian, which you found under my name, which I think sets out the framework reasonably well in my eyes. First is we absolutely need, for Manchester and the other cities who've gone down this road to continue to survive and to thrive in this area, we need the government to keep the faith. The suspicion is that, and 2 former Treasury officials, you will know exactly what I mean when I say this, Heather. The suspicion is that the Whitehall departments are likely to be ever so slightly bolder in cutting the budgets that are devolved than they are on the ones that are retained. And that, of course, that'll affect everybody, whether you've got a devolved settlement or not. So the first thing we need is we need the Treasury that started this process to hold the line with government departments who simply devolve in order to cut the budget. But we also need Treasury, I think, to be bold in other ways too, in pushing the art of the possible. And as an inducement to look at my article, there's quite a good gag that starts it on that subject. But that's not the big issue here. For me, the second thing we've learnt from Manchester that I think we're seeing in different ways in different areas play out differently is the scale of the ambition of the cities themselves. It was said in the 19th century that what Manchester does today, the rest of the world does tomorrow. Well, perhaps that's not true anymore, except in devolution deals. Manchester is never short, because of the work that Howard Bernstein did and people like me helping him, of big ideas. There's always a big idea on the shelf. I have to say, I'm not sure if we're going to get the other cities into the same frame as London. We've got enough big ideas coming out of the cities for how we're going to raise the growth rate. So we need the cities to continue to come up with really good big ideas. But the third thing, and I think the main thing, is actually to go back to where I started, is that what we learned in 10 years, 20 years before that, 30 in total, post the abolition of the Greater Manchester County Council in Manchester, what we learned is that in the end, you don't run a great city by running 10 councils and a bunch of health organisations and a transport thing and meeting occasionally to have a row and then going back into the individual organisations. You run it by deciding you're going to run a place in a systemic way. The city region is run with the same seriousness that any of the different individual local authorities or other constituent bodies are run. This is place shaping. It's exactly like the mutton chop whiskered gentlemen, and they were largely men, who met as city fathers in the 19th century. It's much what they did. That's what's going on in our cities now. And unless we treat this with the seriousness of intent that saw water brought from the Lake District to Manchester, that saw cotton taxes at Liverpool avoided by building a canal and all those other great civic enterprises, unless we have that seriousness, we're not going to fulfil the potential. And my final word will be this, to return to the policy challenge. It's that, even in Manchester, which is the furthest ahead, we have some horrific problems of social exclusion. All the economic policy in the world has not helped enough of those people who were shaken out of long-gone industries in heavy engineering and cotton. I'm doing some work in East London where the same's true around the former Ford factories. We have got some fundamental policy challenges in liberal and social democracy, whether you're centre left, centre right. If we do not use this process of innovation through cities and whatever national policy's got to offer to come up with answers to these questions, I fear our politics is going to take a turn very much for the worse, radical in every direction, in ways that will undermine a lot of the good stuff we've been doing all these last few years.
Interesting. Thank you, Mike. Mark Tewdwr-Jones of Newcastle City Futures. Mike's thrown down a bit of a challenge there, hasn't he? And I was saying to you before we started that I was up in that corner of the world not that long ago, and at that time the feeling was it's impossible to do a deal up here because the local leaders don't agree with each other, and there were kind of deep-seated antipathies, and it doesn't fit together in the way that Manchester fits together as a city region. But a deal has been done. Tell us a bit more about it and whether it's going to work.
Whether it's going to work, that's an interesting one. For me, it's accepting that the devolution platform is not a blank canvas. And you have to accept whether it's recognising different identities within the same city region or region to start with, the different political history, which does play a part even when you're thinking about Future's forward agenda. But within that, there are other things going on. So yes, there's a bag of money that's available that could transform the cities and the region, and think of it much more on the terms of the city and region as well. But there's double-edged sword, so it's about cuts. City Council in Newcastle is facing £190 million worth of cuts in the next 3 years. There's no face-to-face contact with the Council for Public Services after 2019. There are fundamental differences going on at the moment and challenges about how you govern places irrespective of the devolution agenda. And they need to be factored in here. That's one agenda. The other is, in terms of the blank canvas, there's a huge amount going on that could be regarded as innovative. There's a huge amount of innovation that goes on in our cities, except it might not be promoted and led by local authorities. There's a huge amount of innovation that goes on in the creative arts, for example, at community and voluntary sector. Parts of the public sector can be and are innovative, but are not recognised for being this because they have to make do with whatever circumstance they find themselves in. And that creates innovative opportunities. So there's innovation there as well. And certainly in terms of City Futures that I run in Newcastle, the universities have stepped into that vacuum to some extent and said we need to play a more prominent role in the civic agenda and civic life of the cities in which we're located, in place of perhaps some of the other bodies that used to do it in the past. So we are performing a facilitation, a broker role to try and tie all the different sectors together. I think there's a big danger in seeing devolution only on the Treasury terms in terms of economic growth alone. It's a wider set of agendas than that. Yet the key question is, on whose terms are we talking about? And what sort of terms are we talking about here? Who's in the best place to create a long-term vision for a city or city region? And where does the intelligence come from if there's a hollowing out of strategic thinking in local government? Where can you go to get that strategic intelligence from? How to avoid factionalism, which is certainly an issue in the North East. 50% of the North East in the combined authority area is rural, for example. So there's a rural-urban dynamic as well as an urban-urban dynamic within the same area. There's a suggestion in the agreement that the 7 leaders of the council and the elected mayor, that's been resisted by the 7 leaders, it has to be said. They didn't want that as part of the agenda, but they've bit their lip. How can they work together And that's the expectation, that the elected mayor and the 7 leaders will work together. Well, if they work together, what's the point in having an elected mayor in the first place? And where will they come from? And then finally, how do you harness the excellence in innovation that might be promoted by the community and voluntary sector within the place as part of the devolution process? There's a danger that devolution actually will re-centralise issues, and you'll forget the component parts of the city region. You'll forget all the excellent work that's taken place and led by the different sectors and individuals and even citizens within this space as well. So I'm interested in how you marry those things too, between a double devolution going on within the devolution area with the new commitments that might be expected of the elected mayor and the local authorities, and how does the public sector start to be innovative by taking risks?
Interesting. And now we're going to hear from George Ferguson, the Mayor of Bristol, who I know from my session earlier is well into negotiations about the possibility of Bristol getting its own deal. So what can you tell us about what's happening here?
Heather, I mean, this is the Festival of the Future City. So I start with what sort of city do we want? What sort of place do we want? Because otherwise we haven't answered the why. Why are we doing this? We're doing this because we want really good, livable cities that are for people, that are accessible to people, that really tackle the whole issue of social mobility and the things that Mike and Mark have been talking about. And we've got to keep that in our heads all the time. Otherwise, this devolution discussion becomes a game that isn't focused on the end result. In order to do that, we've got to make quite sure that we do build the economy, but we build it really fairly. And so our deal that we are offering to government, because I say it's an offer to government in a city that in a city region that is punching above the national average in terms of the local economy, is a growing city region, which is a challenge in itself, that we've got to make sure that is seen in terms of jobs and fair jobs, and that it's spread across the city region. And something that I found really frustrating in these discussions, the discussions are going well, and I think that we're getting there. There are obvious concerns about Metro Mayor, this comes up time and time again, especially from surrounding areas, but they're beginning to see that the government means what it says in terms of having a legal entity at its centre. You can't have a form of governance so loose that it doesn't have this legal entity at its centre. So what I find so frustrating is that I don't really see boundaries. I don't think most of you see boundaries. If you live on the edge of Bristol, either in it or out of it, it doesn't make a great difference to your perception about where you live. But politicians seem to mind an awful lot about boundaries. And I think that is the whole essence of this. We've got to get into a much more holistic thinking about urban-rural areas that work together, that are much more that are more sustainable in terms of their food production, in terms of their energy, in terms of their transport. You can't deal with any of those issues within a boundary, within a tight boundary. And I think that is absolutely at the heart of it. But the other thing that's absolutely at the heart of it is that we make real local decisions. And that Alex started with talking about strategic planning. I'm so pleased she talked about strategic planning. We're talking about transport, housing, skills. Those are the prime drivers as we see them. But you can't talk about any of those separately. They absolutely come under the whole heading of strategic planning. If we're going to be more productive, we've got to have homes in the right place. We've got to have transport that's connected. We've got to cope with congestion. Now, I welcome an element of congestion, because if you don't have congestion, you've got a dead place. That you've got to that some of those pressures are always going to be there. We've got to accept much greater densification in our cities than we've accepted before, if we are to concentrate the activity where it should be. So the big question, how are we getting on? We're getting on well. And I think that an awful lot of the things that have been said about Manchester was very resistant to a Metro Mayor to begin with. But Manchester, you've got to bear in mind, is working for 10 years on this agenda. And so we have accelerated our learning really fast. I just want to make it absolutely clear, Bristol is absolutely up for it. More than that, we're up for bigger regional thinking. We're up for real powerhouse thinking, because I think that's essential. We're working with Metrodynamics, with Cardiff and Newport on Great Western cities, because historically we've fired arrows across the Severn at each other. We now see the Severn as a shared resource from which we can all benefit. And if we can make faster connections between our cities, and that's between Bristol and Cardiff and Bristol and Birmingham, then we can be really joined up. We can share our respective advantages instead of always competing, thinking, oh, they've got one, we better have one. Let's make it work together. And that is, I think, the great agenda that comes out of devolution, because it forces us to work together in a way that otherwise we might not do so.
And that kind of transport link is an example, is it, of the kind of thing that you think you might be able to achieve if Bristol had greater...
There are two different layers working here. There is the four authorities, that is Bristol at the heart of North Somerset, South Gloucestershire and Bath and North East Somerset. That is where the Devolution deal is being struck. But I think there's a much greater picture about devolved city regions working together, as is being described for the Northern Powerhouse, which is we are beginning to describe with the Great Western cities, that are about big infrastructure, national infrastructure, rather than local infrastructure, and about big inward investment. Because I think that if anybody is going to invest from China, America, wherever it may be, they want to know that they're investing into a whole place rather than into something that they see as relatively minor. They don't understand because they don't see boundaries either.
Mike, I was very struck by what you said about sort of health challenges and you picking that out as a kind of example. Can you give us a sort of, it's always hard to get a sense of the specific kinds of things that authorities might be able to do with these powers that they can't do at the moment? You know, what kind of experiments are you talking about at the local level on public health or prevention or whatever else it might be?
I mean, I could answer that very directly, but I think it's just worth standing back and looking at the nature of our country. So the Prime Minister is not the Chief Executive of the government. The Prime Minister is primus inter pares, the first among equals. That he, or when it's she has got no power to direct a Secretary of State to do anything. The Secretary of State is accountable to Parliament. And it might seem a really odd place to start to answer your question, but it comes very quickly back to the real issue, because it follows, as night follows day, logically from that the reason why anybody who's working in local public service will have experienced the stovepipes of national policy, so that the welfare, the work programme is designed as a welfare to work programme. Health programmes work on health. Skills doesn't even work with welfare, let alone health, and forget business. The reason that happens is a matter of design in our constitution. It's how our government works. And only the Treasury, on a good day, can try and pull rank a bit with using money as a lever to bang people's heads together. But I saw an article the other day saying that there have been about 50 different reports on how we get joined up working going. It's bloody hard because we've got very strong vertical accountability. So I would submit to you that if that's our problem, and let's say, how does it pan out? It pans out that if you are on ESA, i.e. long-term benefits, for more than 2 years, you've got a greater chance of dying than ever getting a job. You'll have been through several welfare programmes, all of which will have failed you. You will probably not have got at any of them the skills training, the mental health support, the family support, the housing support, and all the other things that we know people living in multiple deprivation have. There'll have been absolutely dozens of lead professionals dealing with that family in that situation, and none of them will have had the power to get to the nub of the problem, which is that family are in the shit, and that they need multiple interventions to help them. So how does Manc Health, the devolution deal for Manchester on health, help that? It says that we are going to pool some of that vertical sovereignty that otherwise comes down through the stovepipes at a city level in order to try and create some horizontal accountability so that we can have some governance in place to make those budgets really work together so the money flows to the people in a different framework of accountability. And they'll probably get some things wrong, but if they get some things right, we've very quickly got ourselves a new way of running the National Health Service, and I think that's why it's important.
Which ultimately might be more efficient and not as costly in the long run.
Exactly.
You know, because rather than doing all these different interventions at different levels, you're sort of concentrating it all. Yeah. Mark, you wanted to...
Yeah, I was going to use another example in relation to ageing and the pipe mentality that Mike refers to. Also is replicated at local government level, of course, and it's also applicable in universities. It's all big institutions have silo way of thinking. And so as well as creating new platforms and devolving down, you then face with the silos that exist in a localized or regional context as well. Then if you look for the opportunities of doing something about health or doing something about an aging city, and it's a very rife issue for Newcastle as an aging city, because where's the taxation base coming from? How is the built environment suitable for people to get around much better? The transport system, it cuts across all the sectors. Yet you have a separate director of aging to director of transport to director of housing and so on, and they rarely come together because they're accountable up, they have key performance indicators that go up, and they have their own budgets, or at least currently they have their own budgets, at least. So what we've realized is we need something else to create the ways, the different methods to pull the different relevant actors together, both from within individual institutions and across other institutions as well. So it's caused something of an earthquake, and it's a very uncomfortable thing to do, collaborative work in. Or alignment, we're calling it. We're not calling it integration, we're calling it alignment, where the different directors come together and sit in the same room about a project on the ground. But essentially we're saying, look, if that's the starting point, an aging city, then what are the challenges for housing? What are the challenges for the built environment? And can we use aging as the lens through which we start to look at the city and address some of these problems, rather than find a way of knocking them together and things being lost in the gaps in between. And it means that the experts, the officials, have to get out of their skin for a while and talk to people they wouldn't otherwise talk to and look for the opportunities, and that might mean going outside the authority and those institutions and pulling in the relevant expertise from an age-friendly city quality life partnership, of going directly to communities, of going directly to bus operators, and start to look at what they do from their perspective. That's the only way then you start to look at the possibility of innovative solutions for the future of the city, by accepting where you are at the moment and how you got there and how our governing arrangements are not fit for purpose. So it means a fundamental transformation in the way you think about the city, maybe with the same group of people, with added expertise underway. How do you deliver then on the ground? Well, that's where the universities are stepping into the breach. That's where Newcastle and Northumbria are stepping in. We are bidding for large-scale research projects where the demonstrator projects of those research bids are the cross-sectoral projects that have been identified in that collaborative working. It's a hellish way to do it, I must admit. But if it comes off, then we can demonstrate that we're an innovative city, we're a testbed city, and the communities have been at the heart of that process.
But I mean, I think this is very much, as George said, about focusing on what is all this for, actually. And this is about people, isn't it? In a way, cities are about people and flows of money and the way people live their lives. We've done some work recently showing how the choices people make at different times in their life. And actually, interestingly, people are still making the same choices they were 30 years ago a bit. You know, young people live in cities, you have kids, you move out to the suburbs, you get a bit older, you go to a big house in the countryside. But I think that's starting to change. You get more people who are a bit older wanting to be near the fun and the buzz and the amenities of a city and not have to rely on the car. You get people with kids wanting to be closer. But I think once you start focusing on the outcome, and actually this is about people and the way they live their lives, and the way they do business, and you get specific projects. The more, when we talk to people in cities, we find if you focus on something specific like ageing, you bring people together that cuts across the silos, cuts across their very specific stovepipe mentality to have a project with a clear outcome. That's how you start to break down the barriers. Because if you do it separately, people say, yeah, I understand that you need to do things differently, and I know actually this isn't quite working. But they say, but it's all too hard.
Yeah,
I can't cut across the budget.
It's not real.
Exactly, it's not real. It's not
how things really
specific.
work. Yeah.
Exactly, and actually, cities are a great way. They're big enough to make a difference. They're small enough to make a difference, and small enough to do projects that actually change things.
And the difference between the national and central government is that, the leader of a city council or a mayor can say to his or her professionals, get round the table and talk.
Absolutely.
Once you've got a mayor, the mayor's got the convening power across a wider group of authorities. And as I think as Alex said, you've got a smaller area, which means that the transaction costs are rather easier to deal with than a whole country.
But the biggest difference is we're closer to the
Yeah,
issues and we're
exactly.
closer to the solutions.
Exactly.
So,
It matters more.
and if you're a national politician, you tend to be separated from it. And you might be a local member of parliament, but actually you are separated from the real issues in a
Totally.
very real way.
You're also very directly accountable, which is exactly
And
why central
I'm
government
to blame for
wants
everything.
the-
And in a way, I welcome
it.
that. I love it. I love it that I go around
Yeah.
the city and people think I'm to blame for everything. I mean, I sometimes have to explain. I usually just sop it up. But I think that and certainly the change of leadership, of having an identifiable person to blame, has been absolutely amazing in Bristol. And, Robin, who's Hamilton over there, who's done some research on it, the recognition has moved from 23% up to 70% or something. It's trebled. And that is... and that, I think, is what the government are trying to force us into. And I understand why some people find that a bit scary, but I think once they've done it, they will find that there is a much greater engagement, which is so important if we're to actually be able to respond to the issues and find the solutions with the people rather than
Well, there's
against them.
there's an accountability issue and there's a legitimacy issue as well. So, as an elected mayor, you wouldn't expect the elected mayor... Well, you would expect the elected mayor perhaps to be the conductor of an orchestra, if I can use this metaphor, but you wouldn't expect the elected mayor to play all the instruments of the orchestra, or for that matter, try and write all the scores for each of the musicians. And I think there's a danger that when we see devolution for some cities, for some of the current elected leaders, they see it as they need to step up to the mark and position themselves in that quite naturally and be seen to be leading things. They won't have the resources or finance to be able to lead on some of these things in the future. The picture of existing local government is going to change fundamentally over the next few years. So there has to be a new contractual arrangement with the different sectors within each city about the delivery on the ground. That means the elected mayor has to facilitate and broker and lead, but not ultimately control.
Absolutely.
They have to give legitimacy to the rest of the city to experiment and innovate and be different and distinctive, and that's where you get the strength of the economy and social inclusiveness come in later on.
The Metro Mayor title is a bit scary to local politicians. The reality is the Metro Mayor will have less power over the whole over the whole city region than I have within Bristol. The reality is that Metro Mayor is the chair of a cabinet that will be able to moderate the decisions of that mayor more than is so in a single city under the current legislation. So I think it's scary. And by the way, I'm not going to be that Metro Mayor, so that because I had to say that because South Gloucestershire said that they were all for it as long as it wasn't me, and I thought that's fine. But and I completely understand that. But I think that there's a misunderstanding. I've noticed it.
Yes.
About this power.
Mike,
So again, if you go back to the origins of this, it was in the debates that we had in Manchester around the same time as the Northern Powerhouse speech, the first one in June last year. And our critique of the London model was because originally the Treasury said, well, you can have a London-style mayor. We said, we don't want one. We don't want one for a very simple reason, that the mayor is all powerful on the things where the mayor is all powerful and has no power whatsoever in relation to what local authorities do. And so you have these two tiers of government working within our capital, and it is really difficult to make stuff work between them. It's all contested. And so what evolved in the conversations, and this is for me a lovely early example of that innovation I was talking about, was this idea that you concede the notion of an elected mayor if there was enough on the table, and that was always the negotiation. Because you could, actually, when you've got 10 leaders doing what the Greater Manchester leaders do, they can't bloody do it anymore. It's hard. It's a big city to run. You need some more political leadership to help wear the load. But what you then do in the devolution deal is you give some powers, the most strategic powers, to the mayor, and then you have some of the devolved powers going to the existing local authorities through the combined authority. And it's not exclusively so, but it's largely the transport infrastructure powers that go to the mayor, and it's significantly the people-based stuff going to the combined authority. And what does that do? It locks them into a relationship where they have to work together to make these new functions work. And I think that's a lovely way of running a city. It creates all the right incentives about people having to sit together and think about how the transport works with the welfare to work, how the city region-wide elected person works with the 10 leaders, rather than the splendid isolation that exists in the London model.
Where there's an assembly which is to kind of provide accountability, but no, the powers don't reside with the assembly, really, do they? Nothing resides with the assembly.
No. And they're divorced from the boroughs as well, so it doesn't quite work. I mean, I agree with Micah that actually that kind of sense of partnership between the mayor and the combined authority with the scrutiny there, and I think there will be lots of debate about scrutiny and about checks and balances, and so there should be. But there is something very powerful, and we've been arguing for metro mayors for years from the Centre for Cities, not because it's a panacea. There's no leadership model that's a panacea, but actually one person elected to represent our kind of wider area, which includes the rural areas and the suburbs. Look at Boris in London, elected by the suburbs primarily, actually, not by the centre. And lots of the time people get worried about the suburbs being left out. In London, that's not been the case.
And when it comes to...
a mandate, got a mandate. Ken could have done congestion charging without that mandate, and he managed to do it. You get a mandate and you get the visibility to be shouted at in the street, to be heckled, to be held to account, and I think there's something very powerful.
But when it comes to inward investment, international companies want to know who they're dealing with.
Absolutely.
It's a pretty basic economic factor. That.
Having said that, I think those conversations about devolution below also need to be part of this checks and balances, and I think that's what how do you can't do some of the family stuff at the combined authority level, nor should you. It's inefficient, and it doesn't do actually what the power of the city stuff is, which is wrap things around a family. The troubled family stuff, the stories you get are one family, 4 kids, each got their own special programme to help those kids. They're not working because actually it's an alcoholic mother, a single mother, without the support that she needs, that you need to do to help that family. And that whole family intervention, that's what would make the difference. So thousands and thousands going to not help the children, not help the family. That's a neighbourhood level intervention. And so it should be. So actually making sure in these conversations, at the minute, it's not talked about in that way, and I think it's up to the cities now to start leading those conversations. So they are leading and conducting, but bringing others in.
I'm quite keen to throw it open, but I was just going to ask one more, which sort of came up, which is about austerity. It's a bit of a journalistic word, but we all know George Osborne's going to stand up next week and announce another round of really quite deep spending cuts. What's the risk that these deals end up with the mayors or the local authorities having to implement really quite deep cuts and being held responsible for that? How do you make this work in a period in which the state is shrinking and withdrawing in some ways?
I mean, I would argue, of course, it's a risk. It's a very big risk. There are big cuts coming, but the idea that this wouldn't happen if there were, that devolution is a fig leaf for cuts. The Chancellor's been very clear there are going to be cuts. It's not like he's hiding anything. And if you didn't have devolution, there will still be cuts. So what devolution does is it gives you an opportunity at a city region level to have a bit more control over them. Now, how much control? That's contested. I think there's a big debate to be had about whether central government is giving cities sufficient power to be able to kind of respond to this by saying, we don't need more houses, we need better transport, or we need to invest in skills to kind of make sure that people are able to access the jobs. So there is a question about that, and I think that is potentially a risk, but some of the debate has been about the fig leaf, devolution. I think that's a nonsense. It's not as if the Chancellor's hiding anything, or as if they wouldn't happen anyway. This is going to happen anyway. So I think this is about that.
I think the risk is one of immediacy, because in many ways, because of austerity and because current elected leaders will be on the front pages of local newspapers every day saying about the austerity cuts and the implication, it sometimes is very difficult to sell the idea of devolution in the first place to the electorate, who might be very cynical about additional levels, additional tiers, additional budgets. And in many ways, perhaps some of these leaders have boxed themselves into a corner, unfortunately, by constantly complaining that the government has done this to us. This is the scale of cuts we're going to have to progress. That when there are ring-fence pots of money available to do things in the city, it becomes very difficult to progress it, because the public is saying, oh, you can spend money on a road scheme, but you're cutting our local library. And for them, they don't understand. Why? I don't know. Separate silo budgets and financial pots and treasury accountability issues. They just see, is there money or isn't there money? And you decide to spend money on a range of 10 million highway improvements in the city centre to remove traffic from it, which doesn't go down very well in a car-dominated city as well. So I think it's very difficult. The public are very cynical about the value of devolution, while the austerity issue is a permanency in everyday media. And the North East is in a very vulnerable situation in terms of devolution at the moment, because each of the 7 authorities has to legitimise the deal that's been done, and one authority, Durham, has decided to hold a referendum on it with the electorate. And that goes against the informal agreement about consulting with the public, but they've decided to hold a referendum. If that referendum is negative, the devolution deal all but collapses.
No, it doesn't.
Well, what it does is it shows the degree of factionalism that already exists there and could well exist beyond implementation.
Why doesn't it collapse it, Mike?
Because the bill's very clear on this. It's the Secretary of State could proceed anyway. They could proceed without Durham if it goes that way.
Yeah.
But at the very least, it spices up the already existing.
Yeah, that was my point. Not that there would be no deal. Essentially, there would be very difficult to progress the projects.
Yes.
And spending.
Yeah.
So where will these cuts be? These cuts will be in health, social services, and in the areas that we're not seeking a deal with in our first tranche. We're seeking a deal in basically in infrastructure, transport and homes, and in skills. And it's our money. What we're doing is borrowing $1 billion that we pay back over 10 years. That's our ask or our offer. So it's actually defended from cuts as long as they keep to the basis of the deal. And I think that's been an essential agreement that we've had across the 4 authorities. We're offering a deal that is a payback deal. It's not one that and so unlike Manchester, we've not gone for health at this stage. It doesn't mean that we might not in the future, because I think we need to be more joined up with public and with preventative and primary health, for instance. But I think that it's a very real threat in terms of health and social welfare.
But to Mark's point a second ago, when we were working on the North East deal, there was a real risk, there was a real concern that because it's one of the critiques of this that the government's devolving cuts, and so there's a line in the North East deal to specifically deal with this, which says nothing in this deal is going to make the situation any worse than it would have been had the deal not been done. In fact, there's then the extra resource that goes with it, which is another example of the innovation that comes out of this process.
But I think there is a communication job
to
be done,
and
it hasn't been done. And one of the problems with this debate, and it's easy to fall into, is it becomes quite technocratic. You talk about infrastructure, you talk about funds, you talk about financial instruments, all of which are the means by which you deliver the outcomes. But often it's I don't know, I mean, George talks about this and others do, but it's quite hard to keep talking about jobs, homes, better public services when you're talking about some of the kind of quite technocratic stuff that will actually deliver it. I think it can easily be divorced.
And I think the biggest critique, I'm sure we're going to come on to this, I'd be staggered if we don't, is that this has been done behind closed doors by a bunch of people. And I've taken a lot of flack for this at conferences, but I just think we need to be absolutely clear about the history of this. We had referenda on mayors, on North East regional assemblies. We've had well-organised processes of every kind, including more devolution deals, local public service agreements, local area agreements, multi-area agreements, all these other nonsensical processes. Not one of them produced any devolution of note. The first big budgets the government has put on the table has been through this process. And I'd argue it's because of a smash and grab raid by the Treasury on Whitehall. And if we had had the referenda and all the other things that people say were a good idea, we never would have got here. You know, if you get your city region deal, which I really hope you do, then you will be able to have an election, you'll be able to vote for whoever you want, chuck them out if you don't like them, you can organise, you can do what you want. But we've got to that point because of the thing that people find the most difficult. And I know that's difficult to swallow, and it creates exactly the problem that Alex has talked about. But I think the alternative is a great deal worse, which is frankly that nothing would have happened. But you can shake your head. There's the example of the North East Regional Assembly, the example of the Metro mayors, is that because the enemies of devolution in Whitehall saw the reformers coming, they stopped anything ever being put on the table.
I shake my head merely at the idea that of the contempt that's been shown for the electorate generally. This is something that's been rejected at referenda previously. It's been done behind closed doors, as you say. It adds another layer of bureaucracy to our already bloated bureaucracy, and really is a means of essentially of adding to the democratic deficit.
Wow. Oh, I couldn't disagree more.
That's quite a charge sheet.
Are you a councillor?
No, I'm a lecturer.
Oh, right, okay.
Well, you've sort of preempted it in a way, but did you want to come back? Should I take some more?
Yeah, I mean, there is no... what's been on the table now has never been rejected anywhere. It was a subject of a manifesto commitment by a government elected. It is doing exactly what it said it would do. It is exactly in the traditions of British public life, where governments say they'll do things in manifestos and then do them. It has been agreed to by duly elected leaders. If you want to be elected leader, I would imagine about 700 or 800 votes on a wet Thursday night in May next year will get you elected. You go do it. The point is that now democracy can play its role. I'm absolutely not contemptuous. I want democracy. We all want democracy.
But the problem is, as you pointed out, Mike, the issue is what is voter turnout in local elections? What is the degree of cynicism to the elected leaders as it currently stands, or even the local authorities? That's the first hurdle that needs to be overcome in generating the trust with the citizens about saying this actually will ultimately benefit you in terms of delivery of services in the future. If there's that degree of cynicism of current sets of elected politicians, whether it's at Westminster or locally, then clearly the public are not going to come on board with anything that's been negotiated by some of those actors.
And you understand the cynicism when the strings are pulled from Whitehall to the extent that they've been pulled. You understand that whoever you vote for, the council gets in. And that is, and that is why it's been so low. And actually, because we haven't had the high level of visibility in terms of leadership that I talked about. I absolutely believe that this will lead to more people taking more of an interest because it will really mean a change to their lives in a way that it might not have done before.
There is also something powerful about making sure it's not a new bloated bureaucracy, which...
Oh, totally agree with that.
It's absolutely critical. I think that certainly the cities I've spoken to, that is not the plan. They can't afford that. They absolutely cannot afford for that to happen. They will be moving people from the local authorities to staff this. There is no other way. It is a very valid issue that it needs to be discussed.
And maybe we should reduce
what's going to happen.
Maybe we should reduce the number of councillors too, because if you are... I think the payback would be to go to something that is more American continent, for instance, or European, or even the European continent, where you do have elected mayors, but you have less councillors, because we do have a huge number of councillors in all our authorities, which is a very expensive.
Though fewer than most other countries. Though fewer than most other countries. I agree with you, but we still don't have many on an international comparative basis.
Yeah, but if we were, it's equivalent city in Canada or
I'm going to ask you to surrender the mic.
The final point that I just wanted to make is the idea that there's contempt is the view of the panel generally has been if only the public understood this. If only the public understood this. Well, the public did understand it when it was voted on, and it was rejected. And yet it comes back dressed up in different.
But that was quite. That
the
was
North East
quite a different.
referendum. People have been asked if they want. Hartlepool has rejected its mayor. Doncaster the same. They've had an experience of local accountability, and people have rejected it.
But not around the world, not everywhere. I mean, I agree with you there, but metro mayors have never been voted on.
No, they haven't, and that's the
except
issue.
in London,
but it's been rejected. Other forms of local devolution has been rejected. It's come back dressed up in a different form, and now no one gets a say on it. Now it gets forced through.
Well,
that's
why I'm interested in double devolution. I'm interested in not the public suddenly understanding this and therefore they'll vote in the right way. That is not the way to go, and that won't work. I'm suggesting that under the devolution platform of the city region, that other forms of devolution occur to allow the citizens to take an active part in governing their places. That's how it'll work.
Right.
There's a gentleman sort of about 3 rows back, but directly behind you. Do you see what I mean? I'm making this very difficult on time, but it's the guy with his hand up there. Sorry about this, chaps.
Yes, your left and right's the issue.
There we go. There we go.
Thank you. My name is David Farnsworth. Just to extend this question a little bit further in terms of where does the citizen come in all this? In all the conversations we seem to be having about devolution and the future of cities, which is the theme of this series, whether it's interactions and diversity and powerhouses and devolution, they all seem to me to be in terms of judging cities by economic success. Whereas from the citizen's point of view, it's equally, if not more important, that cities are successful from a social, in a social sense, and have social success. And yet, it also seems to me that the mechanisms by which the citizen takes part in managing and developing and the future of cities, certainly in voting terms, were invented in the 19th century, and to most voters simply do not work anymore. And when we have this mantra, or people talk about this mantra of devolution from Whitehall to City Hall, to most citizens, that's still centralism. City Hall is still centre. So my question really is, do we not need also to reinvent ways in which communities and citizens can be involved, not just in the life of cities and making cities livable, but in managing them?
Interesting.
I mean, as David, you know that we have 14 neighbourhood partnerships, and we have to use that. I mean, I think that we should strengthen that system and give more devolution in terms of local decision making about local non-strategic things to those neighbourhood partnerships. And so I'm absolutely with you on that.
It's interesting because in Newcastle there's no clamour in the city for localism in a coalition government sense. There's hardly any neighbourhood planning that goes on at all. There's one neighbourhood forum, I think, that exists in the city of 300,000, and there's no interest. Now, that would be wrong then to say, therefore, the community are, sceptical about community participation and involvement, or even devolved budgets for that matter. They're totally involved. The citizens are there are hundreds and hundreds of different active organisations in communities and neighbourhoods in the city who are very active, who are very proud of their communities and their cities, despite everything that's happening to them at the moment. But they're not interested in, if I can put it this way, a bastardised form of localism that was introduced by the coalition government. Localism was in existence before the Localism Act. But the trouble is, people in city halls have not recognised the extent of interest and governance that goes on in communities already, or seen a way of harnessing it to their advantage to change some of their existing processes and policies. Perhaps some cities have, like Bristol, but not all cities are like that. And there's a great opportunity as part of this devolution process to do both things in parallel.
Absolutely, yeah.
Does that feel right?
It's a tricky one. Firstly, I it sounds as if you're from Bristol. If you go to where I come from, in Manchester or to the northeast, the economic's really important because there's a lot of people who never got jobs after the jobs went, and there's a big economic agenda in those cities. So I think in some places the economic agenda is more important than it is here. Look, I see local leaders, Tory, Liberal Democrat and Labour and Independent, wrestling with the most blood-curdlingly difficult problems imaginable. You know, in a lot of places you are now cutting statutory entitlements to the very bare minimum, you know, deciding that people with moderate disabilities are going to have to walk to school and walk. It is all. So just if you frame that, and George is nodding, I genuinely believe that is what's going on in town and city halls up and down the country now. Now, is it the case that they could implement that stuff better by having more of the stuff you've talked about? Of course it is. Do I think they have perfect knowledge? Of course I don't. Do I think we'd be in a better place if they did? Yes. So let's innovate and let's make it happen. But in the meanwhile, be very careful about being so cynical about the things that get those people in there to make those decisions, because they're all we've got. So let's innovate. You know, I last couple of Sundays ago and then last Saturday I was participating in citizens' assemblies, one in Southampton, one in Sheffield, to try and get people involved in this. About half the number of people they wanted to turn up turned up. Because in the end, retail politics is people wanting stuff done for them a lot of the time. We're going to need to see community movements rise up. We're going to see all sorts of things happen. But let's not be so cynical about the institutions we've got until we've got some new ones. And let's manage that transition a bit better and you know, try and create some alternatives.
Thanks. My name is Stephen Leyland. There's a quote. Every document of civilization is also a document of barbarism. So I would have been a bit more impressed if I'd seen more of the downsides of devolution, and I haven't heard very much. In particular, the speaker on the right talked about the possibility of a divorce between the families and the instrument of the Metro Mayor and the powers of the Metro Mayor. To me, one of the obvious things of the powers of the Metro Mayor is logistics, traffic planning, highways, all the infrastructure. But once you talk about computer-assisted logistics, it goes down to really fine detail that the people won't recognise has happened to them. And unlike the people stuff, it's really easy to do. So some technocrat will be doing, yes, we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to do that, and people get squeezed into the corner. And in fact, at the moment in Tate Modern, there's an exhibition, and there's a huge framework. Actually, it's in a power station. It's a huge framework in which there are small, high-level triangles that has some seeds for organic growth, the possibility of organic growth. But the rest of the structure is provided for them, and they're left as though people are the garnish, and the recipes provided by the technocrats and logistics.
And so what's your question? You're worried about how people fit into this.
You don't seem to have. You don't seem to allow yourself to talk about the possibility that there might be some downside that could be anticipated now. It seems that you're steamrolling ahead in this hyper-positive manner without thinking about the repercussions.
Panel, we've all been too positive. What are the possible downsides? We've got some definite possible downsides in the North East, aren't there?
Which is that it all kind of if you want me to. That's
seems to be a demand for more negativity.
Let's address the issue of smart cities, digital future cities, and all cities around the world are saying we're a smart city, to the point where it means nothing at all. I'm a bit more sceptical about smart cities because I always say it's important to be a smart city and socially inclusive, because that issue has to be addressed about who's digitally included and who's excluded. If you're talking about families that are in desperate circumstances, the chance they don't have a mobile phone, or they don't have a very smartphone, or they don't have access to the computer, for example, and if all council activities are going to be digital in 5 years' time, that is a very relevant problem, for example. So I'm interested in balancing the use of digital technology with this social inclusiveness and ways of accessing and giving voices to people who don't want to do it through a smart technology, because technology is not the issue. Newcastle rolled out a series of pay points, digital pay points for people to pay council tax, especially in wards, deprived wards. Despite creating the means by which people could get access to these facilities and pay in local shops and things like that, people didn't do it because they didn't trust them. They didn't trust digital technology. The university is trying to do something about this. To give you an example from Newcastle, we bid for government funding, and a lot of government funding is to find science and technological solutions to stuff at the moment. There's very little money available on the social science side. So we captured a bit of money, £12 million from the research bodies to fund something called digital civics. And there's 60 PhD students. No, hold on, and 32 RFs. Research fellowships. And the idea is each one of those are going to work with different parts of the community to implement socially inclusive solutions. They will be digital, it'll tick the box of government and the smart cities agenda, but it will give something back to citizens on the ground. And I'm very proud the university is ensuring that that happens.
I mean, on the point about devolution, clearly there are downsides to every arrangement, right? So devolution, there's a real risk bad decisions will get made. There's a real risk that there won't be the scrutiny that people are so concerned about with metro mayors. I think, things are in place, but there's a risk about that. There's a risk about low turnout. There's a risk about it not being double devolution. It actually gets devolved to one level and not another. There's a risk of too much money being spent on it. There's all kinds of risks. And I think I'm not suggesting that those should be underplayed. I think there is a real risk, though, that doesn't get talked about staying with the status quo. Actually, people talk about postcode lotteries with devolution. Absolutely, there will be differences with devolution. There are big differences now that centralised decision-making haven't got rid of. On your point about it's much easier to make decisions about transport, but actually much less easy to make decisions about people, and often people can get overlooked. I think it's easy to make decisions about transport in a world with limitless money. It's less easy when you've got quite limited money. So I think there are some challenges. I take your point about some of the technology exists, but I think it's not so easy to make decisions about transport without that make sense for people and make sure that you're thinking about the people. And I think that's what a mayor should be, or a metro mayor, or these leaders should be elected for, to think about how people live their lives in a place, what kind of place they want it to be, what the economy should look like, and what quality of life people want. And then to think about the transport in that context, because from an economic point of view, it might be a motorway junction. From a social point of view, it might be the bus network, actually, and improving that. And there are different decisions to be made. So there are downsides. There are risks some of that might not happen. But I think if we can make sure that a debate is had, it is likely, not necessary, but likely, there will be better debates had if you can get some of this money down to a level where actually these decisions get taken. It's because at the moment, those transport decisions get taken in Whitehall. So your bus network gets decided a lot in Whitehall by the commercial operators. The stuff about people gets decided in Whitehall a lot. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be perfect at a devolved level. No way. Absolutely not. Big challenges. Lots of scrutiny needed. Will it be better all the time? Absolutely not. Has it got a good chance of greater innovation and making some decisions that make more sense for a place? On balance, I think it does. Yes, and I think it will be better. But there's no perfection.
And so
interesting.
Heather, could I build on that? So
yeah.
To take three practical examples. 2010 government elected said there'd be no health reforms. Andrew Lansley introduced wholesale health reform. What say did anybody in this room have in that? When in 1988 the Education Bill took away the FE colleges that your local authorities had created and run for generations, what say did you have in that? When the Labour government created regional development agencies that started spraying money around everywhere, what say did you have in that? In this new world, you will have a say in all of those decisions, and some will go wrong, and you'll be able to kick out the people, you'll be able to persecute them the way George gets persecuted when he does something you don't like. And if they're good, you...
Logistical constraints, and not just in planning and not just in transport, but in every aspect of your lives, will be made by a technocratic convenience, and you'll have to fit in with that, and you won't see it because it will happen in the computer. You won't see it other than a sense, well, maybe my life seems more quicker, but it won't. Who to blame? And the thing about it, if the directly elected mayor isn't from your local area, you will find how the 3/4 of the catchment vote in favour of them.
Right, that sounds like a kind of rise of the robots argument, which is slightly alarming, I suppose.
Okay,
I suppose let's come down to the front, gentleman over here. I'm sorry, I'm making you run around, aren't I?
Keeping you fit there. Thank you, Heather. My name is Robin Hambleton. I'm Professor of City Leadership at the University of the West of England. Firstly, I wanted to thank all the panel for the great knowledge they're bringing to this debate, but more than that, your passion. There's a lot of feeling here being expressed, and I think that's just terrific. I want to say something constructive or encouraging, and I want to give a stronger criticism. On the encouraging side, I think we've got different interests in cities coming together in a way that certainly didn't happen when I was in local government. And I think, Mark, you made a very good point about universities can help in this, and I think in different cities, and we do a little bit, University of the West of England and Bristol, to help with city governance. So that's opening up new conversations and ways of thinking, potentially very creative. That's a positive. On the negative, I'm quite fortunate in this recent period anyway of working a lot with cities in other countries. If they were in this room listening to the debate, and I think, Alex, to be fair, in your third point, you did say maybe there's not much happening in this devolution debate if you compare it with overseas. And that's absolutely true. I think there are three criteria that should be used to measure devolution if it means anything. One, constitutional protection for the elected local authorities. That's what happens in Sweden, Germany, US. They have the right to do things differently. Secondly, major tax raising powers. Over 50% of revenue should be raised locally. In Sweden, it's 70%. I'm not asking for that. Thirdly, we need real attention to lifting voter turnout. I asked Greg Clark, some of you may have heard this morning, these 3 points and said, what are you going to be doing about those? He's a very skillful politician. He didn't answer it directly, but basically he said nothing. So my question to you, he's very clear, they're not going to do those three things. My question to you is, are you colluding in a devolution deception? That despite your enthusiasm and energy,
I knew there was a but.
Because those three issues are not getting addressed, you are in danger of colluding in the super centralisation of the English state.
Presumably, you hope you're the thin end of the wedge, do you? Is it rather than you hope that this is the start? Would be the hope. But
absolutely.
I mean, that's true internationally, isn't it? We are a very, very centralised state, and this
hugely centralised. Hugely. I mean, about 5% of kind of local government revenue is raised and spent locally. 95%. A lot of the money goes into central government.
Of the total tax take.
Of the total tax take.
Yeah, we only retain about 5-6%.
So we're hugely centralised. I mean, I think, Robert, if the impression is that this is done now, the devolution is done, that this is all that devolution has to offer, then that's deeply flawed. And I think it would be very dangerous. As I said, fiscal devolution, if you look around the world, most places have much greater power to raise money and then to spend it, and then they're kind of much more directly accountable. Now, I'm not suggesting we move towards the US model, where when they need the money the most, the tax take has dropped the most, and so they're in the most trouble, and they have real challenges around that. But a bit closer to being able to raise some money, to being able to do some things to actually generate money that are about your city. Yes, I think you do need that much more. If UK cities had control just over the property taxes, that's just 14% of total tax take. It's really quite small, but you could do a great deal with that about just kind of making use of that money to invest in people and in places. So I don't think we're colluding in a devolution deception, because we're arguing this is a start. It is a better start than we've seen, much better start, because there is some money on the table. At the moment, it's probably more decentralisation than devolution if you want to kind of enter into the semantics of it. I think there is.
Things aren't being addressed. That's my point.
Sorry?
There's no constitutional protection and there's no tax raising powers, really.
But there's no constitutional protection at all. I mean, I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying still, perhaps it's changed since I was a civil servant, but a prime minister with a majority of one on the floor of the House of Commons can abolish local government in England to as ever thus.
Yeah, that is because we're in the most centralised state in the Western
world.
That's not a good idea.
So the point is that we've just got devolution deals through, certainly the ones I've been involved in, say that this devolution deal in no way fetters the discretion of the existing local authorities. In fact, it protects everything they currently do now. So it doesn't make things any worse. You can argue it should make things better. I'd be in favour of a constitutional convention and all sorts of other things. But in the real world, let's get on with doing what needs doing now. Yeah.
Presumably the hope is that it acts as a circuit breaker for that kind of self-reinforcing argument, which is we can't devolve power locally because local politicians aren't up to the job.
Exactly.
You get terrible turnout. Nobody's interested in what they do, so we'll keep all the money to ourselves. And
Just
until
Heather,
you open up a little bit,
Heather,
you
just
can't
imagine.
really test that.
Yeah,
can
Just
you?
imagine the world in 5 years' time when there's a caucus of a half a dozen or 10 city region mayors haranguing the Treasury and the Prime Minister over issue after issue after issue. That's a better country than the one we've got now, I think.
And actually, I don't think the sticky fingers are so much with the politicians. I think it's much more with the civil servants in Whitehall that don't want to let go of their control. And I think, Robin, you probably agree that this is a step, and you've got to take that first step with an element of faith. But so I don't feel that I'm entering into some black deal. I think that I am entering into a step in the right direction. But we're a million miles away from where we eventually need to get to.
Exactly.
And that is closer to, say, the German city-state type of devolution that is established in constitution.
I was just going to ask, if the powers are being devolved out of central government, are you getting a corresponding number of people and expertise out of central government as well?
Great question.
Yeah, so if the powers are being devolved from central government, are you getting a corresponding level of people and expertise from central government? That's a really interesting
Just getting your
question, I
workload and your inbox bigger.
You're not, and it's a real issue around the kind of capacity and kind of building up that capacity and skills. I mean, I think there's big questions for central government about what role they play in supporting places, in providing some of that expertise. I don't think they have got the hang of this yet. I don't think they've rethought their roles at all for the reasons that George was saying, that actually officials are deeply resistant to this. They don't want this to happen. And rethinking the role they would play and how they might help places do this requires quite a threat to their existence. So no, I don't think that is happening. I think that's one of the biggest challenges we face actually in the weeks and months ahead, how you really make sure people have got the skills and expertise and time, as your point, alongside everything else they're doing, because this is coming with lots of big public service issues, really challenging questions with austerity about what you do and don't do. So, there's an awful lot coming. So,
but against that, it'll be much more attractive working in local government when it's got more power.
Absolutely.
And I think
that will attract the good people.
That's a great question.
I mean, I think Mike might know this more than I do, haven't been involved, but certainly I think as part of the North East agreement, there was an attempt at a deal on terms of movement of civil servants from the southeast to the northeast, and that was one of the red lines. They couldn't be broached, unfortunately, at this point in time. Doesn't mean to say that it couldn't be brought up, pending what happens in the new year and beyond, as part of that agreement. But of course, what's happened is on the ground in the individual local authorities, there's been a massive hollowing out, and certainly on the policy, on the strategic thinking side, that has gone. Or the people have had to reapply for the jobs and now hold 3 different portfolios. It's very difficult, if you like, for the local authority to be able to function in the way they're used to. So I think there's a difficulty for, going back to the innovation, for some of the existing officials, whether they transfer to the combined authority or stay where they are, if they're lucky enough to keep their jobs, will find it very difficult to raise their head above the parapet to come up with innovative new ways of thinking while fighting fires simultaneously.
I think that is a risk in the future, but I have to say in the North East, I was all there every inch of the way with the North East on their negotiations, and I tell you, the ideas that came out of the people who are in the North East local authorities and the way they work together to turn them into a package for negotiation, and the same in the West Midlands, was extraordinary. It's just you almost there is less analytical capacity. This is exactly the sort of stuff that does get cut. I'm not arguing with that, but there are still people sat in a lot of local authorities in little nooks and crannies, writing slightly tedious reports that not many people read. Who, when you get them together and say, "Look, here's a big problem. Can we solve it together?" All of a sudden they come alive. The big ideas start to flow, and that's a reflex we need to exercise more while those people are still there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Jonas Torrance from the University of Sussex. I'm interested in the relation between devolution and the parallel process of decentralization of the energy system and the efforts that municipalities have been doing in trying to promote that. I would like to ask your opinion, and as a sort of subsidiary question, there's also a major difference between Britain and other countries in the sense that local governments also have been destituted of many of the assets in terms of public services, for example, energy companies, water companies, and so on. And so what is the role of remunicipalization in that sense?
I think it's a good question.
Interesting, yeah. So about decentralisation of energy and
well, we've just set up our own energy company because I think that it has a triple bottom line. It has one in terms of energy poverty, and that's a very big issue in a city that has got such disparate wealth, such a big wealth gap, and also in terms of driving towards cleaner and more environmentally responsible energy production. But thirdly, and maybe most importantly, is looking towards an alternative source of income in a way that Birmingham did in the Victorian times, where they were running and making and prospering from their energy and water companies and what have you. So I think absolutely that is the sort of thing that will emerge out of devolution, and maybe across city regions rather than just within the city as it currently lies. And Nottingham are doing the same thing. And I think I'm hoping that we will be given the powers, we'll be released of the restrictions, put it that way, that have in the past stopped us from doing these things.
Yeah, I mean, we're doing my think tank, and all our reports are on the website, so I'm not kind of plugging things you have to pay for, but we're just about to do a report on city assets, all about actually how local authorities across the country are being really innovative in thinking about the assets they've got and what they can do with them to kind of generate revenue streams, to reinvest into public services. And so this is happening regardless of devolution. This is just going on now. Not everyone's doing it, but there are some interesting examples, and energy certainly comes up in some of them, and across the country in conversations we're having. It's something places are thinking about.
As an alternative source, if you haven't got the tax raising powers, and it's an
and
alternative
also
source
it works
of
for the
revenue.
place. I think it's not just about money; it's about the place.
I've taken a risk, and I think that's important. And we're right at the front of it. Watch what happens. If it works, I'm sure everybody will do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that for us, looking at that issue, for example, is a form of thinking about our economic growth possibilities for the future. So you can look at inward investment as one solution. We're looking at indigenous growth and finding what the assets are and getting people to look at their place in a different way, to identify assets which might be coming from social, natural issues, natural resource issues, as opposed to economic job creation, inward investment issues. And that means looking at your city in a different way to look for those opportunities as well. North East, we're looking at subsea and subsea engineering futures as being an economic catalyst for the future for the city as well. So there are all sorts of ways you can look at this, and it means having a very different perspective and challenging actually some of the inward investment teams in local authorities about taking a much broader perspective of an economic future for an urban area than perhaps some of them currently do.
Yeah, rather than a financial services cluster or a
Exactly,
biotech cluster, which are the two things.
Well, I remember
I constantly get press releases to go and see up and down the country.
The late, not so lamented Deputy Prime Minister Northern Future initiative that occurred just before the general election, and the Treasury team came up to Newcastle and asked us what we saw as our economic future. And after 2 hours talking of negativity, obviously, we moved on to the positives and started to highlight our sectors that could be the answer, looking at Kielder Water, looking at a very broad way of thinking about the future of Newcastle and whether it could trade with other places that might lack some of these resources, of course, as well. And the Treasury official said, well, surely the answer is just to be at the end of the line at HS2, HS3. That's all you need. And therefore, you can milk the success of Leeds and Manchester, who are then milking the success of London in terms of models for the future. And saying that's the last thing we want, the total last thing we want.
I think that is the end of the line,
isn't
it, really?
We're an hour and a half from Leeds in Newcastle. We're an hour and a half from Edinburgh, indeed. So, that way of looking at the world, end of pipe almost in a different sort of way, is not going to secure the city future.
We've got 5 minutes, 6 minutes left, my digital clock is telling me. Should we just very quickly, I suppose, take from each of you just a quick thought about where you think or hope that we will be in kind of 5 years' time? I've got a fairly good sense of it, but what do you think? What would you like to see?
I'd like to see metro mayors which have got strong turnout, which have really kind of got people talking about their cities and where they want their city regions to be. I'd like to see more fiscal powers on the table. I'd like to see cities able to raise taxes. by talking to the electorate and talking about what those taxes are for, and not additional taxes, I should be clear, but actually just keeping some of that money in the local place so you can spend it. I'd like to see cities debating, where they're going and what they are, and kind of a lot of that pride is there. It's in neighbourhoods, it's in cities already. Capturing that to be able to talk about where your city's going and people having a sense they've affected where that city's going, that actually the transport's better, you've got buses where you need them, you're getting more homes built. It's not going to be perfect in 5 years. It's a small amount of time, but metro mayors that have got debate going, more fiscal powers, and a kind of continuation of things coming out of government would be a good start, I think, for 5 years.
Mike?
So I could easily paint a quite dystopian view of where we could end up.
Well, we haven't been dystopian enough, apparently. So,
but I think to try and avoid that, what I hope we see is a mayor's caucus with some very grown-up politicians who've been elected by majorities of their local populations, really calling the British state to account for the first time in generations about big issues. With big money being devolved to tackle social, environmental and economic issues. And that out of that, that is both a product of and a precursor to a more vibrant democratic life in our big cities, a renewal of our political institutions, perhaps the death of some and the growth of some others, and that we avoid a lurch to a politics which I think to a kind of politics which I can see happening far left and far right in this country if we don't revivify the core institutions of democratic life in this country.
Interesting. Mark?
I see this as the start of the process. It's an ongoing process, and there will be difficulties, lots of bumps on the way. I think certainly it'll vary region to region, I think, as well in the forms that it will take on, I think. I'm concerned about rescaling issues, whether it would, for some people, it would be the re-centralisation issues that Robin mentioned, and what opportunities are there to ensure that that doesn't happen on the ground in different parts of the devolved area. You already get to a stage where parts of Northumberland are asking for Hadrian's Wall to be rebuilt, for example, because they'd much rather be with Scotland than with Sunderland in the same region. That says it all. I'm interested in ways that we can pitch and sell the notion of devolution to a much broader spectrum of people beyond those fantastic officials who've been negotiating on our behalf. It's time the public were integral to discussions about the form that takes, and also I think the private sector as well. They have to be step up to the mark and be part of the governance frame much more than they are at present. I'm interested in bringing citizens in, double devolution. I'm interested in bringing universities, because at the moment there's a higher degree of public trust with God knows why, with higher education than with some of the other public sector, and that we can harness that as well. Universities are changing, of course, as well as government and local government as well. And I think through a combination of all those different sectors working together, where the leaders of councils, the elected mayor plays a facilitating choreographic part, we can come up with long-term, ambitious, innovative directions for cities in the future. It's not going to be easy, it's going to be quite exciting, but it could happen.
George, you're going to sign on the bottom line by the sound of it? You're going to get that deal done.
Hopefully,
yeah.
And I think I would like to see local pride replacing local cynicism, and a much greater willingness of civil society to come in as part of the local governance, and that includes obviously our universities, and a much greater real neighbourhood involvement in the way that communities are the communities define themselves, and I think making quite sure that this is what I hope happens by 2020, when I certainly bow out, is that Bristol is defined in a much bigger way than it currently is by its region, rather than just by the boundary which rather artificially contains it.
Thank you very much. I think we've had a really interesting discussion, and it's certainly made me, as someone who sits in London spending their working life writing about economic policy, it's made me make a lot of mental notes to get out more. So that's that's very good, apart from anything else. But I think it's been really interesting. And so I'd like to thank the panel, Alexandra Jones and Mike Emmerich, Mark Tewdwr-Jones and George Ferguson. Perhaps we could thank them in the usual way. Thank you very much.